Whenever I tell people I study brains, a lot of them tend to ask me a certain kind of question. They ask me, what is it about my brain that makes me want to do fill in the blank, right? Why do I always want such and such? What is it about my brain that makes me think this way? And maybe you got into neuroscience because of a question just like that. I know I did. I was intensely curious. I still am intensely curious about the neurological roots of my own motivations and biases and vices, and those of the people around me too. You know, why do any of us love so much to indulge in things that we know are bad for us? Why do we love to take things that could be good for us in moderation and then take them way too far until they cause us problems? You know, why are some of us so easily persuaded by popular opinion, even when that opinion contradicts the facts? What is it about our brains that makes us do these things and think this way? Well, my guest today on episode 15 of the Connectome podcast is a researcher who's spent her whole career studying exactly these kinds of questions. Teagan Wall studies the neuroscience of addiction and motivation and decision-making. And she's here to give us all some insight on how to counteract our bad habits and maybe develop some better ones too. Well, Teagan, thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to start by asking how you got into behavioral neuroscience, because you started your career in economics, which seems like a very different field. So let's start at the beginning. What was it that made you curious about economics?
So really, I was curious about why people make the choices they make. Why do people buy beef over pork? Why do people make these decisions? And so the branch of economics I was really interested in was behavioral economics and like game theory and very micro decision economics.
So you were studying behavioral economics, and what made you make the leap from there into behavioral neuroscience?
Well, there was a bunch of experiments that were actually being done by the economics department on the campus where I was studying. And all of these studies were being done using 18 to 25-year-olds. So they were using undergraduate students to measure and test all of these sort of economic hypotheses. And something about that just seemed really off to me. So I started looking into it more and started thinking about neurodevelopment and how that relates to decision making, and was sort of disappointed in the fact that that discussion wasn't being had in economics. That the ability to postpone present gratification in order to gain future gratification is something that we develop much, much later, and yet we were using these 18 to 25-year-olds to sort of measure things that could very strongly affect. And so I sort of moved into reading more about neuroscience. I started doing some work, doing data analysis and running experiments in a neuroscience lab on campus. And I just sort of got more interested in the biological bases for these decision-making ideas, and less sort of in the pure mathematical, if we assume that everyone always acts in their own best interest, then this is what falls out thing that economics tends to do.
So you decided it was important to bring a neurological perspective to these economic discussions. And it sounds like that perspective was badly needed. Now, this touches on a question that I get asked by a lot of students, which is, Okay, let's say I realize that I need to get informed about some other field, some different field, in order to understand my topic properly, the way I want to understand it. So how do I start that process? Right? Where do I go? Who do I start asking to find out how to study the topic from the perspective of this other field? And so for anyone who's listening right now, who's wondering about that question, let's walk through the practical side of how you branched out from economics into neuroscience. How did you approach that branching out process on a practical level?
So I was being mentored by a economics professor who was actually doing mostly game theory and some experimental stuff. And I decided he had asked me if I was interested in going to grad school. And I was thinking about it, and I decided that it would be a good idea to write a proposal, basically an experiment proposal, or I didn't realize it at the time, but it was basically I was writing a grant proposal to sort of study how the age of participants in economic studies affects certain aspects of the results. And so I started writing this proposal, and I started writing it not very well. And I came to this advisor and I said, hey, I want to learn more about this. I want to write a proposal for this. I want to see what research is already out there. And he gave me a lot of guidance on how to do a lit search, how to, build these arguments, how to format these things in a way that, more than anything, it improved my ability to search for information on my own and my ability to put it into cohesive argument for why this is something that should be studied more in the future. So having a really good advisor was really important, and then knowing what tools are available and how to access them and how to use them in order to get either the information that you're looking for or to find out that the information you're looking for doesn't exist yet.
So you started moving in a neuroscience direction initially just by going to your mentors and advisors and asking, how do I find this information? Or even what kind of information do I need to be looking for? I mean, it sounds like you didn't so much immediately dive in with a bunch of technical neuroscience at first, so much as you sought out better ways to frame the research questions.
Right. So I had gone to several professors and I had said, hey, is this something that you've considered? And they basically said, no, that's not our point of view. That's not the direction that we come at these things from. And so I was like, okay, well, what if I wanted to do that? And I sort of had to gain the skills necessary to come at it from that perspective. And I was really lucky that even though the professors I talked to said that's not how we think about these problems, no one said don't think about these problems in that way.
That's great that you had that kind of support. And so it sounds like a key step for any student or researcher who wants to approach their field from a new or unorthodox perspective is to find that person or those people who will offer that support and who will push you to keep refining your questions and to keep approaching those questions from new directions, even when the path isn't always clear. And you did eventually find that path for yourself. You took a lot of the ideas you'd learned in behavioral economics and you started asking very similar questions from a neuroscience perspective. And one of the things you studied in your early research, which you touched on a few minutes ago, is the fact that the human brain's wiring doesn't finish developing until sometime around age 25, which means that when we complain about, teenagers having poor impulse control or 20-somethings not planning for their futures, we're actually pointing out a biological fact, which is that the brain areas responsible for conscious decision-making and planning literally aren't physically formed yet at that age.
So the proposal that I actually wrote, and in the research I was doing for that proposal, looked a lot at car insurance companies because it turns out that car insurance companies and car rental companies have had this right a lot longer than we really knew what there was to get right. So the idea of neurodevelopment has gone through several different phases, and for a long time, we thought that your brains were basically done very early on and that you had what you had and that was it. And we sort of found more recently that no, it actually continues on until about 25. And 25 is, like I said, when car insurance rates go down or when car companies are willing to rent cars to you. So your full ability to make decisions isn't formed until about 25. The last thing to really develop in the brain is the prefrontal cortex. And this is responsible for things like theory of mind, which is basically your ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. So there's a lot of empathy involved in that as well. It's involved in planning and being able to weigh benefits and consequences in sort of a temporal sphere. So being able to say, I will get this now or I will get that later, and sort of properly weight the time it takes in between those things. Yeah, so it's involved in a lot of things, and this is why we see issues with drug, alcohol, and nicotine use in teenagers so prevalently, is because they're not really able to properly weight the future consequences of those actions. This is why we find teenagers so much harder to relate to, is because it tends to be very difficult for them to empathize in a adult capacity with the people they're dealing with.
And that exact topic, smoking addiction, was the focus of your graduate thesis. Tell me a little about what specifically you were studying there and what you found.
Well, so my thesis was actually on a very specific subtype of nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and the nicotine works on that exact same system. And just like a lot of other neurotransmitters, you have different subtypes and different subunits that make up each receptor, and that affects how the drug binds to it and how that affects the bigger sort of behavioral consequences that we see downstream. It also can indicate where in the brain that receptor is found. So in the case of nicotine receptors, we have a subunit called the alpha-6 subunit that is only found in a select few places in the brain, and primarily it's found in the midbrain on dopaminergic neurons. So dopamine is really, really important for a lot of things. And one of the main things it's important for is learning and reward. So when you answer a question and you get that question right, you get a burst of dopamine in your brain. When you answer a question and you get that question wrong, you actually get a decrease. So these sorts of reward sort of things, both from nicotine or external stimuli and from internal rewards and deficits, are all sort of encoded by dopamine. So we were interested in how this subtype affects nicotine addiction. Like, what role does this specific subtype play in nicotine addiction? And we thought that it was going to play a very, very crucial role because it's so tightly related to the reward system. And it turns out we were right, but it actually played a sort of different role than we initially expected.
Dopamine, probably one of the most misunderstood chemicals of all time, right? I actually have a tattoo of a dopamine molecule on my arm. And sometimes when I tell people what it is, they go, oh yeah, dopamine, the happy chemical, which, I mean, it's cool that they've heard of dopamine, but that's really not how dopamine works. I mean, how would you describe in general what dopamine actually does in the brain?
Well, so initially we were working with a pharmaceutical company to develop a drug that could selectively activate these receptors. Because the thought process was that if we could create a drug that did this, that selectively activates these type of receptors, you would sort of get that constant reward and you wouldn't need to smoke. So you would get those dopamine levels up to a baseline that you had when you were smoking, and you wouldn't crave cigarettes. What we actually found is, at least at very low doses, the drug that we were primarily working with increased smoking or increased nicotine self-administration in animal models. So there's still a lot of sort of work to be done in this area, but it's sort of the first time we've seen a compound increase self-administration of nicotine. And it raises some interesting questions about how the reward system works and how that plays into addiction.
So dopamine isn't really a chemical that makes you happy so much as it's a chemical that helps link causes and effects in our brains, which doesn't sound nearly as cool, but I mean, that's what it does. It helps us learn positive associations. It's also involved in movement and in a wide variety of other functions in ways that we're only just beginning to understand. And how did dopamine tie into your research on cigarette addiction and on that subtype of nicotine receptor you were studying?
So the big thing I would say is dopamine is definitely responsible for things like reward. So happiness is part of it, but it's unclear really whether having dopamine makes you happy or if experiencing happiness releases dopamine. Does that make sense?
And so you found that the subtype of nicotine receptor you were studying was actually directly involved in the reward system, but its role was different from what you'd expected. So what was that different role you discovered? What were the implications of that?
Exactly. So it's sort of unclear exactly what the role of dopamine is in that regard. In other areas, dopamine is incredibly important for movement. So Parkinson's patients tend to have very low levels of dopamine. One of the main prescription drugs for people with Parkinson's is called L-Dopa, which is an artificial dopamine. So it's necessary for regulating specifically voluntary movement. So, I mean, dopamine really has its hands in everything. So when you run, yes, you do get a dopamine boost. When you eat, you get a dopamine boost. When you get a question right, you get a dopamine boost. When you sleep properly, you get a dopamine boost. But at the same time, if you don't run, if you stay and watch a TV show you like, you'll get a dopamine boost. If you get a question wrong, dopamine will go down. If you stub your toe, dopamine will go down. These sorts of things are encoded by dopamine more than you're actually doing them for the dopamine itself.
So you actually managed to discover the potential for a drug that would increase the desire for nicotine. It sounds like it could be the worst idea ever, but it could actually have potential for people who suffer from diseases like Parkinson's, where nicotine and dopamine receptors are involved in movement, and those receptors are damaged, like you pointed out a few minutes ago. And to get even more practical, let's talk about the questions I posed at the beginning of this episode. You know, why do we make bad decisions? How can we make better decisions? I get asked these questions a lot, and I'm sure you get asked them all the time too. So what has your research taught you about how to make better choices?
So a lot of the work that I've done in the past has been on animal models because we primarily want to break down decisions into their most basic components. Humans have what we call the mind that tends to get in the way of good data in your experiments when you're looking at something like addiction. And I would say that actually for a lot of people that can be most beneficial is we have this concept of the mind. We have the ability to be self-aware and to self-regulate. And so I think being aware of your, not necessarily addictions, but of your proclivities, being aware of the things that make you very, very happy or make you very, very sad or that you are inclined to overindulge in, and taking that into account when you're making decisions can be extremely beneficial. Making sure that that's in the front of your mind, that you're not letting that piece of it run on autopilot in the background.
Yeah, it does. And I know that in certain brain areas, I think in the prefrontal cortex, an excess of dopamine is actually associated with mental disorders like paranoid schizophrenia.
Right.
Okay, so just making sure you're consciously aware of your biases, your tendencies, your weaknesses, all of that, calling that stuff to the forefront of your mind and asking, am I being influenced by this right now? That can help you make much clearer decisions. It makes sense. I mean, what are some other areas besides addiction where you see people really fall victim to these weaknesses and make bad decisions?
So these days, I actually have a day job in finance, which creates some really, really interesting decision stuff. I can't really talk so much specifically about what I'm doing at my job, but the idea of taking neuroscience and applying it to finance is sort of a really interesting one.
Yeah, money is an area where a lot of us, I'm going to go ahead and say all of us at one time or another make decisions that sacrifice the long-term good for the sake of an immediate reward. We see a new gadget or a cool new pair of shoes, whatever it is, every now and then. And for a few minutes, we all turn into teenagers with no impulse control. And we ask, well, why did we do that? Why did I buy that? I mean, what are some cases you've seen where people's decisions about money just totally fly off the rails?
Well, the big thing would be like bubbles in markets. So the idea of a bubble in a market is where you get a whole bunch of people who look at a price that is increasing and who believe, for whatever reason, that the price is going to continue to increase. And when everyone piles onto buying this, it basically creates false demand for this thing, which from a neuroscience perspective, you can think of it as if everyone else wants this thing, it must be a good thing, which creates more and more people piling on. And then sort of an emperor's new clothes situation. Someone says, wait, this thing's actually worth a lot less than we're all paying for it. And everybody freaks out and everybody gets rid of it at once.
And that exact pattern you describe, everybody pays more and more and more until finally the bubble bursts and everyone just tries to dump everything. I mean, that's exactly what we saw in the internet stock bubble in the early 2000s. And also, of course, in the housing bubble that left us in a recession when it popped in 2008. I mean, it's scary to think that our money in the bank and the value of the property we own could be so much at the mercy of such a mob mentality. But that is exactly what's turned out to be true again and again.
Exactly. And there's all sorts of things like this sort of the modeling that's been created for this is very, very interesting from a neuroscience perspective, because you can think of it very similarly to addiction.
Okay, and so what is the underlying pattern in all these things? Addiction, stock market bubbles, all these destructive behaviors. What's the common factor here?
Well, the big thing that I like to point out is, let's say that you have never had a drink before in your life, and you're not sure how good drinking is. And you have your first drink, and you really enjoy it. And so you start drinking pretty regularly, with your friends. From time to time, you'll have a glass of wine or a beer on the weekends. And as you drink more, you meet more people who drink, and drinking becomes cooler and cooler. And so now you're having, 2 drinks a day, or now you're actually getting really, really drunk on the weekends until you reach a point where, okay, now you're drinking alone on a Tuesday. And as it gets worse and worse and worse, suddenly there's this sort of shift. Someone says, hey, this is bad. Drinking is not worth nearly as much as we thought it was worth. And then generally what happens when you look at AA programs, when you look at all of these different programs to quit, what people tell you is cold turkey. You slowly sort of ramp up what you see in people drinking until they're at this extreme amount. And then the bubble bursts and they're suddenly cold turkey back at a very, very low level.
So that abrupt cutoff from overindulgence to cold turkey is really similar to the pattern of a stock market bubble, where everyone essentially quits their investments cold turkey, right? And suddenly they wake up and look around them and see all the destruction they've caused along the way. And have you seen this pattern in any other areas? What about in your own life? Have you seen it in your own life?
I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, there was a period of time where I was really into ice skating. And originally my brother was the ice skater. And then slowly but surely I got more and more. And I was willing to sacrifice all of my other hobbies. And ice skating was my thing. And then at some point I was like, yeah, I'm never going to be a professional skater. And it just was gone.
Well, that ice skating example is really interesting to me because it makes me wonder about something. Is this kind of addictive behavior always a bad thing? I mean, what if I can get addicted to jogging or wilderness hikes? You know, what if I get addicted to eating salads? Is it maybe possible to harness this innate addictive tendency for some kind of constructive purpose?
Well, so in a lot of ways we would think that'd be really great, but we do actually see people who have things like exercise addiction. So there is a type of anorexia where people basically compulsively exercise.
So it comes back to the same thing then. Anything can be taken too far. An addiction to too much exercise and too few calories, we might call that anorexia. You know, at the very least, work your muscles past the point that you're deriving any benefit from it. And, you know, that's clearly not healthy. And while most of us probably don't have to worry about getting that hooked on exercise, I mean, it still shows that there's a point where too much of a good thing is no longer a good thing.
Exactly. And so again, this goes back to, you know, knowing yourself and being aware of what influences your decisions to begin with, both in the motivating you to do something and the motivating you to be moderate in how much you do something.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. If you're going to get addicted to anything, get addicted to moderation. And that leads me to one final question, which is, you know, why is it that some of us seem to find moderation so easy and others seem to get totally addicted to anything they enjoy? You know, why are some of us so much more vulnerable to addiction than others are?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things both for nicotine and for alcohol that sort of suggests possible genetic bases for addiction. I know there was one paper that showed that if you have a certain mutation in your alpha-6 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, then you are significantly less price sensitive to changes in tobacco pricing. So there's sort of been this idea the past several years where if we just tax cigarettes like crazy, then we'll price people out of it. And this study showed that there's actually a group of people who you can't price out of it, who once they're addicted, the price isn't actually going to have an effect on how much they smoke.
So in the end, we still have a lot more research to do before we understand why some people get addicted so much more easily than others. But what we do understand, at least somewhat, is how addiction takes shape in our brains and what we can do to keep those kind of tendencies in check, which is just stay mindful of what's happening in your mind and body. Stay aware of those tendencies and watch out for yourself and watch out for yourself. You know what I mean? Well, thank you so much, Teagan, for joining us here on episode 15 of the Connectome podcast. And for those of you listening, we've got a whole lineup of fascinating researchers already on deck for 2016. I can't wait to introduce you to all of them. See you next time. And until then, go do some science!